Not Cut Out for Heroics, a fanfiction written by Ended Flames, published on AO3, chapters 10 to 15, read by me, Cole. I hope you'll enjoy it. Chapter 11, Therapy, Heroes and Scars. Katsuki had been surprised when Ryoku actually replied to him. It had only been an hour or so when he got the ping and read through the long paragraph that he'd been sent. Ryoku telling him he still had a chance lifted some kind of metaphorical weight off of his shoulders. He didn't even know he'd been carrying. That sounded so fucking stupid. Katsuki almost gagged. He wasn't sure what UA would consider the severity of his crime as. Assault definitely wasn't the worst thing he could have gotten. He was glad the police hadn't registered it as an attempted murder. But whatever the severity, there was nothing against trying. That meant that he had to be the best. He had to train more and be the best out of all the other extras so that he could be able to get in. Upon looking up UA's entrance exam requirements, he was glad to find that they were one of the schools that didn't say anything against criminal records. That meant he'd just have to use these last 6 months, plus a few weeks, to train even harder than before. Katsuki had to get first place if he had any hope of getting into the hero course. He had wanted to start his new intense training plan, which he'd begun to make on a Word document, the next day after school, but then he remembered he had his first mandatory therapy session after school that day. Saying that Katsuki didn't want to go to therapy was a huge understatement. The hag had to drag him by the hood of the jacket he'd changed into when he got home from school out of the house, while Katsuki threatened to blow her and everything around them to bits. By the time they had actually arrived, Mitsuki was glad that her son had calmed down to the point where he was just brooding and not threatening to destroy everything. He would never admit it. Of course he wouldn't. He was Katsuki Bakugou. But the therapy hadn't been all that bad. The therapist had been nice. She was called Yua Kirishima, and she'd had a plate of shortbread cookies cut into little star shapes and decorated with icing sugar. The cookies were a little sweet for Katsuki, but aside from that, the therapy had been tolerable. He'd refused to talk for most part. He didn't want to tell the woman shit about himself. He'd never met her before, and they were expecting him to what? Tell her his feelings and be all sappy or whatever. No, he didn't do that. But she had been patient with him. She didn't press to begin with. She'd said she wanted him to be comfortable with sharing things with her, so they'd spent the first session with a one-sided conversation, her trying to let him get more comfortable around her. Not gonna fucking happen. 4 weeks after the injury, Izuku had gone back to the hospital so that the doctors could check up on the worst wounds he'd gotten to make sure they were healing properly. There was the possibility that he'd be able to have the wiring holding his jaw in place removed soon, meaning he'd be able to talk again and start filming the backlog of videos he had planned. He'd spent an hour in the hospital waiting room on his phone chatting with his admin team, which he could be found doing a lot lately. They'd been better friends to him than Kacchan ever was. He enjoyed talking to them. Heck, he enjoyed the chaos that ensued when Sleepy Cat and Sadness were together, and he loved how supportive and helpful Crimson Riot's supremacy was, even if he wasn't as active as everyone else. He was apparently preparing for the UA entrance exam. Sleepycat had said he was too. Maybe Izuku could make a video with tips for passing the entrance exam. He might be able to help his friends out a bit. Maybe he could ask Brett for some help with that, since she was already a hero in training. But she wasn't online right now, since she somehow had a normal sleep schedule, and it was currently around 7 a.m. for her. Apparently it was a normal to sleep really late on weekends. He brought his thoughts back to the discussion at hand. The three admins were talking about their favorite heroes and encounters they'd had. Izuku smiled and read through the last few messages before sending one of his own. SYS. I met Hawks once. He was on patrol and I got an autograph. Nothing special, but he's pretty cool in person. SC. I don't think I've ever met a hero. My favorite is Eraserhead, though. He's an underground. CRS. My favorite hero is obvious. He's so manly, but I've never met him. He retired too early for me to have the chance. SC. Oh, that sucks. CRS. Still, he's super manly though. I have a few autographs from other heroes. I met at a HeroCon when I went 1 year though. Izuku smiled at the picture he sent, a pinboard with a couple pieces of paper, each signed by a different hero, pinned up. Some were more famous heroes like Bastionist or Gang Orca. Izuku could see others were less famous. The hero team Waterhose there, and the Wild Wild Pussycat signatures as well were a few lesser known heroes. Izuku decided after a few moments of hesitations to add his own experience to the discussion. RA. I met All Might a few months ago. I also used to chase villain fights, so I got a lot of autographs from that. CRS. You met All Might? As in the #1 hero? Really? Dude, that's awesome! RA. Not really. He saved me from a villain, crushed my dreams, and left me crying on a roof. CRS. Wait! SC. That's not cool, dude. SYS. Damn, didn't think that was something the greatest hero ever would do. Sorry that happened to you, dude. CRS. Wait a minute. He left you crying on the roof? RA. Yeah? Why? CRS. Hold on, I'll be back. Izuku stared at his phone in confusion. Why was that such a big deal? Why was one of his admins getting so worked up about that? He never found out what Crimson Riot's supremacy was so worked up about, because he called in for his checkup by the nurse before he got back. He'd sent a quick goodbye. He'd told them he was going in for a hospital checkup later. The doctor had a different one to the woman who'd been there when he'd first been brought in, had gotten straight to the test, inspecting his burn wounds first and taking notes on how they were healing. He already knew that they were going to leave some pretty bad scars, but he didn't really mind that. Scars were physical reminders that you'd gotten through hard times after all. He didn't hate the multiple scars he already had on his body. The star-shaped burn scars on his arms from the explosions, the scar on his right collarbone that he'd gotten from one time he'd been pushed and gotten a bad cut. He'd patched it up as best as he could until he got home, when he could bandage it properly with the medical supplies he kept handy. As much as he didn't hate them, though, he never showed them off. He didn't like the idea of being asked where they came from. He didn't want to explain the pattern of similar scars from different occasions. He didn't want to hurt Kachan by telling people what he'd done. But he'd already done that, hadn't he? His mom had told him the result of Kachan's questioning. The criminal record, the restraining order. Izuku knew Kachan would hate the idea of therapy most of all. He knew that his former friend still had a chance at UA, a chance to achieve his dreams, since he'd done that research to answer the question he'd gotten on his server a while ago. But it still didn't erase what he'd done. If Kachan didn't get in, it would be his fault. He was the one who gave him a criminal record. "Your wounds are healing as expected," the doctor told him. "You can expect the burns to heal in around 3 more weeks. The wires in your jaw should be removed in a week." Izuku nodded, confirming what he had heard and understood. "You will need to keep talking to a minimum for a week or so after that until your jaw is used to the movement again. I'd suggest starting off small and slowly, easing your way back into it before returning to school." Izuku nodded again, waiting for the man to say that it was okay for him to leave. "All right then, you're free to go." Izuku hopped out of "All right then, you're free to go." Izuku hopped out of the chair easily. "Want a sticker before you go?" Izuku knew he was probably too old now to be getting stickers from a hospital and dentist visits, but they were good to add to his hero collection, so he wasn't about to complain. He nodded. The doctor picked up a stack of hero stickers, fanning them out in his hand and offering them to Izuku, allowing him to pick one. He took a hawk sticker from the pack. He had a few of these kinds of stickers in his room at home, but he didn't have one of the winged hero. Izuku smiled at the doctor before pocketing the sticker and leaving the room, going back to his mom, who had been waiting for him in the waiting room. Chapter 12. Izuku Midoriya. Kirishima stared at his laptop screen, his chin resting on his hand, surprise on his face. He was supposed to be studying right now. Instead, he was talking with the other admins on Ryuku's Discord server about their favorite heroes. He had sent them a picture of his autograph board, but something Ryuku had said sent Kirishima's mind for a loop. R.A. Not really. He saved me from a villain attack, crushed my dreams, and left me on the roof crying. His mom had told him she'd found that one boy crying on their roof a few months ago, hadn't she? Obviously it couldn't have been anyone. He was sure there was a lot of roofs a kid had been left crying on, but surely that wasn't something that happened often. He'd said it was a few months ago as well. His mom had found this kid a few months ago, right? 3 or 4 months ago? It could have just been a coincidence, right? The boy had left as soon as Kirishima had gotten home. He hadn't even said anything to him. He had given him a name, though. Now, if only Kirishima could remember it. His mom would remember. Dang it! If only he could remember. He thought it started with an I. Kirishima sat there, trying to think for a good 10 minutes before he decided he should just go and ask. He'd actually do the work he was supposed to be doing later. He shook his head and stood up, walking into the living room of his apartment, where his mom was tapping away at her phone while savoring one of her wife's shortbread star cookies. Hey, Mom? Do you remember that kid you brought in from the roof a few months ago? Kirishima asked once his mom had looked up from her screen. Her expression had turned thoughtful before realization crossed her face. Oh, you mean the kid with green hair and freckles? Yeah, him. Do you remember his name? Or did he tell you why he was up there? His name was... She thought for a second. His name was Izuku Midoriya. And all he really told me was that he wasn't up there to jump. Yeah, that sounds alright. Thanks, Mom. Kirishima called, rushing back to his room and leaving his mother just a little confused. Back in his room, he pulled his laptop towards him, opening up the admin chat. Ryoko had gone for a hospital appointment pretty soon after he'd left himself, and wasn't back yet. Kirishima opened up a DM and typed out a message, but he hesitated to send it. Should he even ask at all? What if he wasn't Midoriya, and that just freaked him out? What if he was, and then thought Kirishima was some kind of stalker? He probably didn't want his identity out on the internet. That much was obvious from the fact that he had gone to such lengths to hide his identity. And then Kirishima was curious and he wanted to know. Maybe he should wait until Ryoko was back online. Once Izuku had gotten home from the hospital, he'd added his sticker to his small collection he'd started. He already had a few stickers and he'd been given one last time he'd been at the hospital as well. His next order of business was to update his friends on what was going on. He knew when he'd be back now, so he should probably announce that to everyone. But his friends got to know first. Izuku didn't realize how excited he was to get back to recording until he typed out the message to send to the admin channel. He had missed making his videos. Even if he'd have to record them with his arm still in a sling, he was excited to be back. R.A. Just got home. The doctor said I should be back to speaking in just over a week, so I'll be able to make videos again. Sleepy Cat replied instantly, as did the other admins except CRS, who apparently was idle. Izuku wondered briefly what was up with him. He'd replied weirdly to his short story about All Might. Now he was offline? His questions were answered when he got a DM. CRS. Hey, Ryoko? This might sound really weird, but can I ask you something? Bad sign. Izuku was getting even more nervous about this. If he was worried about asking him something that left Izuku to wonder how bad the question was, what if it was something that he couldn't answer? He didn't want to let his friend down, but he had to reply, right? R.A. Sure. I'm sure it won't sound that bad. I've gotten some weird questions. CRS. I'm sure you haven't gotten this one. Are you that boy who my mom found on a roof 5 months ago? Izuku Midoriya? Izuku nearly threw his phone across the room. Instead, he just sat there, staring wide-eyed at the message on the screen. What was he supposed to do in this situation? He didn't plan for something like this to happen. This meant that Crimson Riot's supremacy had to be the boy he hadn't even talked to. He had been so eager to leave then. He could easily lie. There was nothing stopping him from saying that he had no idea who Crimson Riot's supremacy was talking about. But he didn't really want to. Izuku really wasn't a fan of lying. Anyway, because he lied to his mom and a lot of other people about a lot of things didn't mean he enjoyed it, nor was he all that amazing at it. His mom just believed almost anything he said. And this was a new friend, someone who probably trusted him to tell some kind of truth. He couldn't lie. Izuku knew that. So the only option he really had to answer him with the truth and tell him not to tell anyone else. He didn't want the wrong people to hear about his real identity. R.A. Definitely haven't gotten that question before. If I was hypothetically, would you go around telling everyone? CRS. Of course I wouldn't. I'm your friend. That would be so not manly of me. R.A. Then yeah, that's me. I'm Midoriya. CRS. Wait, really? I was right? R.A. Yeah. Izuku wasn't sure exactly what to say to that. He always knew there was the possibility that someone would figure out who he was, but he hadn't expected it to happen so soon. CRS. You're not going to ban me for life, are you? R.A. No. Why would I do that? As long as you don't tell anyone. Please don't tell anyone. If the wrong people find out who I am, I may as well be dead. CRS. It's that bad? I won't tell, dude. I already said that wouldn't be manly. You can trust me. Izuku let out a sigh of relief and sent back a smiley face, gently flopping back into his chair. He reached for his script notebooks, looking through all the videos he had planned and scripted. He couldn't wait to film them. The first video he planned on filming was the new idea he had, giving some tips on getting through hero course exams. Since he already knew a few people who were trying out and doing the video sooner rather than later, it would mean people had more time to use his tips. If they wanted, of course. Izuku smiled as he sent the DM to Brett, asking her if she wanted to help him out with the video. 2 weeks later, Izuku was back to speaking normally again. He'd given his jaw time to get used to talking again like the doctor had told him, and now he was back to filming again. Right now, he was on a voice call with Brett, filming his first video to be posted after he returned to the video they'd been planning about tips for the hero course entrance exams. Brett had suggested that she actually was in the video to give some tips in person, being a hero student already. Obviously she couldn't be there in person since she lived across the world, but voice chat was probably the next best thing. Izuku had fun filming that video. Brett was just as fun to talk to in person as through text. Maybe they should try an admin voice chat at some point. That video took a lot of editing. Apparently Brad had a similar tendency to go off track as he did, so that ended in a lot of off-topic rambling that Izuku had to cut out but overall it had been one of his favorite videos to make so far. Over the next few weeks, Izuku had created a lot of his backlogged videos from over the last 5 weeks. The one on Endeavor was fun, though he was worried that the hero might come after him if he watched it. Izuku wasn't a huge fan of the Flame Hero. He was way too violent and barely acknowledged his fans. Hawks would make a much better number 2. And that had definitely shown through the video. He hoped he wouldn't have the number 2 after him. The video he'd done on Quirk bias and discrimination had started a lot of discourse, but the majority of his Discord community had come to his consensus that shaming people for their quirks was wrong. He'd thought about using that video to reveal the fact that he was quirkless, but he didn't want to give away something so identifying. One person had already found out his identity after all. He didn't need more people knowing who he was. The more people who knew, the more likely he was to get out. Another week later, and Izuku was finally free of the remaining bandages. His shoulder and back still ached a little sometimes, but the actual burns had scarred over, the shape of the scars reminding him of stars. At least he'd rather think of that than have them remind him of the explosions that caused them. The doctor had given him the okay to get back to school along with another sticker the day before, but Izuku wasn't sure he wanted to go back. He wanted to apologize to Kachan for getting him in trouble, but then he'd probably just get blown up again. As much as he wanted to apologize, his fear of the blonde's explosions warned him off before he'd even seen him. Besides that, online school had been working incredibly well for him. He was already onto the courses for the next semester, meaning he was definitely ahead of where everyone else would be. It couldn't be because he was smarter. He wasn't, obviously. He was still as useless as he had been before. But maybe it was because he was enjoying it more without having to worry about people coming to attack him around every corner. Whatever the reason, he was doing a lot better in online school and hoped he could keep doing that instead of going back to Aldera. Inko had not noticed the positive improvements that online school, along with his ever-growing, Inko followed it religiously, even if she wasn't quite as interested in heroes as others. YouTube channel had caused. Izuku was a lot more confident. He didn't contradict himself with self-doubt quite so much, since he'd been able to move around properly again. He'd gone back to going out to do whatever it was he did, as long as it was healthy. Inko didn't mind. He seemed so much more confident. He didn't turn into a stuttering mess as soon as someone who wasn't her talked to him. She'd heard him on the phone to multiple people in this room. Presumably friends he'd made through YouTube. She knew her son was smart enough to know how to stay safe online, so she trusted his judgment. So when Izuku approached her about remaining in online school, Inko was happy to agree. She hadn't seen her son so happy as he had been the last 2 weeks in a long time, after all. Chapter 13. Meet at the beach. Katsuki's therapist would say he'd come far in the last 4 months. He himself didn't exactly agree. He was still the angry, explosive person he had always been. She might have taught him a few different ways to calm down and contain his anger, so he didn't explode on everyone and anyone around him. But he was still Bakugou. He still recognized his personality as his. He was still the best. He was still going to be the number one hero. He was still the person who'd gotten a criminal record and a restraining order because he couldn't just accept the fact that Deku was quirkless and move on with his life. No, he had to beat the nerd within an inch of his life just because he felt Deku was less than he was. If he was asked, Katsuki would never say he regretted it, but at least he could acknowledge that what he did was wrong. He'd had the passing thought that maybe he should apologize for what he did, but that was only a passing thought. Katsuki didn't apologize. Even if he did, he'd never gotten so much as a chance. In fact, since the event, he hadn't seen the nerd once. 4 months ago, when his teacher had announced that Deku had officially dropped out of Aldera, most of the class had cheered. 1 or 2 had a look of pity on their faces, others were indifferent. Katsuki had felt a little sick. Was what he did really bad enough for Izuku to not come back? But it wasn't just him, was it? It was everyone who followed him as well. It wasn't just Katsuki doing the damage, though he may have been the one to start it all off. Now, it was only 2 weeks until the UA entrance exam. He wondered if he'd be able to do well enough in the exams to get in with his criminal record and his potentially not so heroic personality. He'd been training hard, studying whenever he could. He was still getting straight A's in school, so Katsuki doubted that was something he needed to worry about so much. So the only thing he hadn't been training was his quirk. Though his quirk was already the best, how could he train that to be better? That's how he, once again, found himself about to make a request for help on Ryoku's Discord server. He hadn't exactly been active. He'd been too busy training, but he knew the community had grown. Ryoku probably didn't remember him from before, so he wasn't worried about posting another request. Not that he would be anyway, but still. This time, rather than in the questions channel, he went to video requests. Asking for a video on explosion quirks wouldn't be weird, right? He didn't want to sound stupid, plus he knew that recordings of quirks like his were blacklisted. But this wasn't a recording, so he was free to talk about it, right? Why the fuck did he care so much? He didn't even know the damn guy. It wasn't like he ever really talked on the server, but for some reason he didn't want to do anything to offend Ryoku. A reason that Katsuki couldn't quite figure out why. That's why he hesitated with his request before muttering, "Fuck it!" and sending the goddamn message. It was just a few words on a screen. Ryoku could ignore them if he wanted. When Izuku had gotten a request to do a video on explosion quirks from the same person who'd asked the question about the criminal record 2 weeks before UA entrance exam, he was surprised. He ignored the small suspicion that he had momentarily popping into his mind. That was impossible and stupid. It wasn't like this was the first kind of request like this he'd gotten. He'd had requests for multiple different types of quirks. Electricity, sound and verbal activation type quirks had been his favorite of the bunch. But he was sure about this one. On one hand, Izuku didn't like explosion quirks. To be honest, any fire quirk spooked him a little. On the other, out of all kinds of quirks, he could probably give the best analysis on explosion quirks, having experienced one firsthand since he was 4 years old. He had half a notebook dedicated to mainly Kachan's quirk. Some of the other parts of that half were brief pages about his gang and how to avoid them all. So theoretically he could make the video. He just wasn't sure if he wanted to or not. Which is why he ended up screenshotting the request and sending it to the admin chat, asking whether they thought he should do the video or not. The only other admin online was CRS, who'd ended up being nicknamed Chris by Brett, because it was easier to say. The nickname had been picked up by the others along with Sleepy Cat, calling him Crispy, as some kind of half-assed attempt as an insult. Chris, you're not a fan of explosion quirks, right? That's why it's on the blacklist. I'd say if you're comfortable doing it, then go for it. Don't do it if you're not fully comfortable with it, dude. R.A. The problem is, I don't know whether I'm up for it or not. I already have enough analysis to make a series out of it. I just don't know if I can confidently say what I want to. Chris. Well, just give it a go. We're here to support you. Whatever you choose to do about it will definitely be super manly. Izuku huffed. Chris was right. He'd never know if he never tried. The script for this particular video had been difficult to write. There were a lot of tips he could think of to give to Explosion Quirks users, but there was always the worry that someone would take offense to the criticism like he knew Kachan would. And then there was the possibility that Kachan would see this video if he even managed to get past the script. After multiple hours of writing and rewriting, Izuku finally had a script he was happy with. Now it was just for the filming part. In his opinion, the scripting part had just been the most difficult of the process of making this particular video, but filming it had been almost as hard. He tried his best to speak confidently, like he usually did, but it was so hard with this topic. He'd had to refilm the video 3 times to finally get a result he was happy enough with. It was painfully obvious to Izuku how much more forced this video was than his others. He just hoped that his viewers wouldn't notice. Once it was finally posted, Izuku decided to leave the house and go down to Dagoba Beach to make a little more progress. He'd gotten pretty far with it over the past months. Around 3/4 of the beach were cleared now. He was pretty sure he'd seen a couple other people helping out, though he usually didn't go to the beach if he saw them there. It was usually just 2 people, a boy with spiky red hair and a hardening quirk, who seemed oddly familiar, even though Izuku had only started seeing him in the last week. He seemed to be helping out with the heavier appliances and some kind of training routine. The other was a girl with bouncy pink hair who had started taking a lot of scrap metal and spare parts to who knows where the moment he asked around for assistance on forums months ago. Half the time he saw her talking to herself and thought she may be some kind of young mad scientist or something, but at least the beach was getting cleared. Izuku usually avoided talking to anyone at the beach, a little worried that they'd be someone from Eldera, or that he'd be recognized as Ryoku, or both. But today he wasn't so lucky. The red-haired boy was at the beach and Izuku didn't manage to get away before he was noticed. He'd ended up accidentally meeting the boy's eyes and he couldn't help staying after he'd seen his face light up in recognition, but no malice or hatred. Although he had no clue who he was, this boy obviously knew him. "Hey, I recognize you," he cheered, running over with a tire over his shoulder to stand in front of him, a bright smile on his face showing his pointed teeth. Izuku recognized that smile. "You're Izuku Midoriya!" Izuku shuffled back a little. He hadn't been around other people in a while, since he no longer went to school in person, and had no friends to actually go out with. He had never been used to social interactions. How did this work again? "Chris?" Izuku asked. His voice came out only just more than a whisper, and his tone was more of a question than a statement, but Izuku guessed it would do. The boy in front of him snorted at the nickname. "That's me, but my actual name is Ichigo Kirishima. Nice to properly meet you." Kirishima smiled, holding out a hand to Izuku to shake. The green-haired boy glanced at the hand, looked up at Kirishima's face, then went back at the hand before shaking it. Nice to meet you properly again," Izuku asked before muttering about how he really needed to get out more under his breath. "So what brings you here?" Kirishima asked, putting down the tire and sitting on the wall separating the beach from the road and patting the empty space on the wall, offering Izuku the spot next to him. "I'm trained for the UA entrance exams. They're soon." "Oh, I've just been clearing the beach in my free time. I actually just started after I met then," Izuku replied, the nervous edge in his voice still present, but still he sat down next to Kirishima. Izuku had expected to spend the last few hours before the sunset walking back and forth clearing the beach. Instead, he sat at a two-person table outside of a cute little cafe eating an ice cream cone in January with Kirishima, who'd been nothing but friendly towards him the entire time. He'd gotten a lot more comfortable around the red-haired boy over the time they'd spent together. They laughed and joked. They talked about just about anything. Izuku found himself easing into the conversation better than he'd expected. When they'd first gotten ice cream, Kirishima suggested, they'd decided to take a selfie together as a commemoration for their first day of friendship. Izuku laughed and asked if he could send it on the admin channel, which Kirishima had agreed to do. After Izuku blurred out his own face, Kirishima had told him not to bother with his, and he sent it in. They'd exchanged numbers, even though they already had each other's Discord users, so it wasn't exactly that big of a deal. When Kirishima said he had to get home, Izuku had headed off as well, back to his own house. He smiled when he checked his phone to see Sadness enraged at the fact that they were eating ice cream in January, and Sleepy Cat, who was enraged that they were eating ice cream in January without him. Brett just sent a picture of herself chilling, literally, on a beach in the snow, wearing shorts and sandals. Izuku loved his admins. That was definitely a good way to end the day, like today. Chapter 14. Entrance Exams. It was the day of the UA entrance exams. Izuku had started the day by posting a message on both his Discord server and YouTube community page saying good luck to anyone who would be taking them, before getting ready for the day. Even though he wouldn't be taking the practical exam that the hero course examinees were taking, he'd still need to take the written portion to get into Get-Ed. Unfortunately, it was on the same day. Although the one for the hero course was the day after, that meant he risked running into Kachan. He had personally wished Kirishima and Sleepy Cat luck in the admin channel, so did Brett and Sadness, who apparently didn't want to go down the hero route. She never really shared anything about her personal life, which led Izuku to have a small suspicion that she wasn't exactly on the right side of the law. Izuku stared up at the gates of UA, then around at all the people, the other examinees. They were supposed to come in their middle school uniforms. Izuku didn't go to a middle school anymore, obviously, so he chose to wear an Eraserhead hoodie, a custom design. There had been a textiles and sewing sector of his online class which he'd found interesting, and black jeans. He didn't want to stand out, but he still felt other people's stares, probably questioning why a kid who wasn't in a uniform was at UA. Ignoring them, Izuku made his way towards the school, finding himself entranced with the way the bright sunlight reflected off the glass walls of UA. Izuku didn't realize he was about to walk into someone until he was on the floor from impact. As he realized who he'd walked into, he was filled with dread. He recognized the instinctive explosion that he heard above him. "Ka-chan!" Izuku squeaked from the floor. I'm sorry, I wasn't looking, and I bumped into you, and I...
Deku! The fuck are you doing here?
Ka-chan interrupted him. His tone was irritated, but it wasn't the deadly anger that Izuku remembered. Was Ka-chan actually cooperating with the therapy, or was this Ka-chan's long-lost twin or something? I'm here to take the exam for the cadet course, Izuku muttered, looking at the floor and fiddling with the hem of his hoodie.
Whatever, I have to go. Have fun in nerd class, Deku.
It was an insult, paired with some sparks from his quirks. Izuku flinched back a little. But Ka-chan only walked away from him, shoving his hands in his pockets, leaving Izuku confused on the floor. Was that really Ka-chan? Why didn't he yell? Well, I guess he did, but not like he used to. But he has the restraining order on him, so he wasn't even supposed to come near me. I guess that interaction was my fault. I guess that's why he was so quick to leave.
Midoriya! Ryoku!
He was snapped out of his daze as his YouTube alias was hissed at him, quiet enough that no one else would hear. Along with a light tap on his face, he blinked to find Kirishima crouched down next to him. Huh? What? Izuku looked around, remembering where he was and realizing multiple people were staring. Izuku began to panic before Kirishima put a hand on his shoulder, helping to calm him down.
You okay, man? You were just spaced out, muttering on the floor.
Kirishima asked, simultaneously helping Izuku to his feet. The smaller smoothed out his hoodie before smiling. Yeah, I'm good. I got lost in thought. Izuku clarified, smiling. Good luck on the practical, by the way. I know you've got this. Remember, you're the wrecking ball, not the wall. Kirishima nodded, a determined look on his face.
I'll smash this exam!
Izuku held his hand out for a fist bump. Kirishima happily obliged before they parted ways, the taller headed for the auditorium and the shorter heading for the classroom he'd been assigned to take the exam. It would be a lie for Izuku to say he wasn't surprised when he entered the room. In fact, he thought he was in the wrong place, but the sign outside the room clearly read Gannett Exam Room 1, and he wasn't that early, only a few minutes. Was there really only 14 other people taking the exam? On the UA website they said that 20 out of the 60 Gannett places were for hero course dropouts, but the lack of people here purely for Gannett itself made Izuku think that the number was a lot higher. The way Midnight looked at him from the teacher's desk before telling him to take a seat made him a little uncomfortable, but luckily, or not, depends on the opinion, he was used to the weird remarks from his comment section. It was only a small amount of people, but there were always a few. No matter who he was, when he'd first gotten an inappropriate comment, he was weirded out, and not to mention wanted to take down his entire channel. Instead, he'd just deleted the comment and moved on. But now, he was used to the stuff like that, so Midnight didn't throw him off as much as she might have 10 months ago. As the clock ticked down to the official beginning of the 3-hour test, Izuku let his mind wander. He was gazing in the R-rated hero's direction, thinking about how impractical her costume was. She'd be much better off wearing some kind of leotard with exposed limbs like Miruko than the skin-tight cloth suit she wore. She could still keep her image and reputation while maximizing the effectiveness of her quirk, which Izuku felt didn't reach its full potential with her scent having to diffuse through a layer of cloth before it could reach her opponent and put them to sleep. Izuku snapped out of it. He'd have to make a video on Midnight later, when the hero announced the beginning of the exam time. He had flown ahead with the questions, most of them being somewhat basic, having progressed a small way into the high school courses. He'd finished the last semester of work 2 weeks early and was bored. A lot of the questions asked were easier than he expected. After 2 of the 3 hours, Izuku had completed all the questions. He spent the remaining hour going over his answers multiple times, changing answers he wasn't happy with, and double-checking math questions. He had only found a couple of mistakes in his work, but it was all worth correcting. Izuku was sure that there were many smarter people who couldn't make it into the hero course because they didn't have a flashy quirk. The exams favored, every mark would count if he wanted to get in. A week later, Izuku got his letter. He knew Kirishima had already gotten his letter from his excitedly spamming the admin saying that he'd gotten in. Sleepy Cat had been disappointed. He got the same letter yesterday, but he DM'd Izuku specifically saying that he was right about the exams favoring flashy quirks and that he hadn't been able to use his quirk in the exam at all. Izuku thought it was incredibly unfair. He was sure there were many people who were in the same position as Sleepy Cat, whose quirk would be amazing for heroics, but just weren't flashy enough for the exams. Though Sleepy Cat never actually revealed his quirk, but Izuku knew that any quirk would be amazing. Izuku opened his letter in his room, sitting at his desk. He skim-read it before reading it over fully, finding that he'd gotten into the Gannett course. He grinned as he showed his mom the letter. Inko had hugged him tight, telling him she'd be making katsudon for dinner as a celebration. He wanted to tell his admins, but they didn't know he was taking the exam. One person knowing who he was enough. Knowing that he was in Gannett, as a Gannett student, narrowed down the search for anyone else to 1 in 60 rather than whatever odds it was before, which Izuku knew was considerably larger. "I'm going to UA!" Nezu sat at his office, looking through the written exam papers of the students who'd actually gotten into UA this year. It was only a few days until the beginning of the school year. The principal wanted to work out who the intelligent students were so he could keep a closer eye on them. There were definitely some impressive scores. Most of them had gotten into the hero course. Yaoyorozu Momo and Shoto Todoroki were given as recommended students. Nezu expected level of intelligence they showed. Yaoyorozu had gotten 97% and Todoroki had gotten 94%. Of course there were others, Bakugou Katsuki being one of the top scorers. Kendo Itsuka had done considerably well, along with Kirishima Eiichiro. They were all promising students indeed, but the one that stood out to him the most was the kid who applied only to Gannett, not taking the hero course exams like most other students did. Midoriya Izuku had scored 98% on the exam. The only question he'd gotten wrong were a few questions on English, but otherwise his test was exceptional. Nezu was definitely going to keep an eye on this kid. Nezu was a little confused as to why Midoriya hadn't tried for the hero exams, but his question was answered when he picked up the boy's files. The Quirkless written in bold letters underneath his name and age answered most of his questions. He'd dropped out of middle school months ago, instead having signed up for online courses, where he'd made more progress in these months than he had in the rest of the school year. Nezu folded his paws in front of him. He'd have to keep an eye on Midoriya. If he showed any more promising skills, the principal might have to train the boy himself. For now, though, he'd just have to watch and wait. Chapter 15. The beginning of a friendship. Izuku was both excited and incredibly nervous for his first day at UA. After 7 months of online school, Izuku was worried about how it would go, integrating back into school, especially a school like UA. He was scared it would be like Aldera, that people would find out that Izuku was quirkless and then he'd be a target again. But then again, most of the teachers were pro-heroes. He was so excited to meet them. Hopefully he could get autographs. He was excited for new classes. He'd be separate from Kachang and he'd be able to experience UA's teaching firsthand. Maybe he could even sneak a look at the hero course. It'd give him more quirk analysis. Kirishima was freaking out in the admin chest. Izuku knew he had a few issues with self-confidence. To Izuku it was obvious. Maybe that was because he suffered similar issues. He did his best to encourage him, telling the red-haired boy that it would be fine, that it would go perfectly, that he'd be an amazing hero. Izuku had arrived in his classroom 15 minutes early. It wasn't like he'd wanted to be that early, but he preferred hanging out in the classroom to hanging around outside and risk running into scary people. So he sat down at his desk, pulled out his scripting notebook and his quirk analysis notebook, and began scripting the video he was planning about midnight. He had been so engrossed in what he was doing that he hadn't noticed the class slowly beginning to fill up until someone screeched. Izuku instinctively put his hand over his ears, looking up and around, noticing the amount of people who had arrived since he started working. Izuku quickly put his notebooks away. He didn't need to risk anyone seeing them. Only moments before the bell, the final member of the class ran into the room. Izuku barely got to see what he looked like, as before he'd thrown himself into the seat next to Izuku, rested his forehead on the table and let out what sounded like a sigh of relief before covering his ears. There were only a few moments to be intrigued by the other boy's action before Izuku's own hand covered his ears, when a loud yell resounded through the hallway and President Mike appeared in their classroom.
Good morning, listeners!
Mike said with enthusiasm, in his voice not dropping for a second.
I am Hitsashi Yamada, or President Mike, your homeroom teacher for the year.
A few students cheered, matching the enthusiasm. Others just looked bored and thoroughly unimpressed. Izuku heard the boy next to him groan, rubbing his eyes.
Today we're just gonna do orientation, then we can hang here until lunch. When you listeners get to go home, proper classes will start tomorrow.
Mike announced before standing up and going to the door, followed by the rest of the students. Izuku stuck to the back of the group, ending up walking next to the same boy. He finally got a proper look at the boy's appearance. He had purple hair that defied gravity along with dark bags under his eye. Neither of them talked as they were led to the welcome ceremony. Other students were chatting excitedly. Mike himself was making conversation with some of the more enthusiastic students until they reached a large hall where Nezu was already waiting to give some kind of speech on a podium. After the welcome speech, they'd been shown around the school. Izuku tried his best to make a mental map of this place, hoping that he wouldn't get lost at all. That would be embarrassing. Now they were back in classroom 1C, Mike announcing the activity that they'd be doing from now until it was time to go home again.
An exercise to get to know each other. You listeners are going to be in the studio together for this whole year, meaning you should get to know the people you'll be around.
Well, now Izuku was screwed, wasn't he?
All you gotta do now is turn to the person next to you and tell them your name and something interesting about yourself. Go!
The class exploded into chatter. The two people on Izuku's right had paired up, which left him with the quiet boy he'd ended up next to for the most of the day. He spared a glance over at him. The boy huffed and pulled his bag up onto the table and smacked his face into it.
I guess you're not a fan of icebreakers either, huh?
Izuku said, not quite quiet enough to be a whisper. The boy snapped his head up, glaring at Izuku's direction.
Yeah, whatever, he said. I'm not here to make some dumb friends.
Izuku chuckled dryly. He was a little worried he'd end up spending the year friendless like he was as well. At least it was an upgrade from last year. There was no bullying as of yet, but he knew not to get his hopes up too far.
I don't like them either,
Izuku said before muttering, I was always singled out as the different kid.
What was that?
Nothing. I didn't say anything. Izuku yelped, startled at the boy actually hearing him. He'd thought his voice would be quiet enough that he wouldn't hear over the ruckus of the class. Izuku sighed as the purple-haired boy put his face back into his bag. I'm Izuku Midoriya. By the way, maybe we can be outcasts together? Izuku stated, unsure as to whether the boy was still listening to him.
Shinzo Hitoshi, now leave me alone so I can sleep. All right, listeners, time's up. I want you guys to share something you learned about your partner to the rest of the class,
Mike announced happily. Izuku couldn't notice the pro stare at Shinzo, who looked just as horrified as Izuku felt.
Of course he did that.
Once Mike started going around the class one by one, each student saying something they learned about their classmate. Mostly it was either a quirk or an interest.
What am I supposed to say?
Shinzo hissed at him across the table, quiet enough to not be heard. I don't know. I'm a fan of Eraserhead. Izuku hissed back. What about
Shinzo? What did you learn about your partner?
Well, there goes any good first impressions I could have made.
Midoriya is an Eraserhead fan?
Shinzo asked, phrasing it almost like a question as he repeated what Izuku had just told him. Mike looked at Izuku for confirmation, who nodded with a small smile.
Hey, you're the listener who came to the entrance exam in the Eraserhead hoodie that Midnight told us about,
Mike yelled, pointing dramatically at him.
She called you a green bean! And everything!
Izuku felt his face go red. The teachers were already talking about him. Yeah, that was me. Yeah, he's a cool hero. Izuku muttered, not wanting to speak too loud in front of the class out of fear that had been ingrained in his head since he was 4 years old.
That's super neat, little listener. I'm an Eraser fan too.
Izuku saw Shinzo roll his eyes.
All right, next!
Mike moved on to the next student, forgetting completely about Izuku's turn. He let out a sigh of relief and slumping back into his chair, taking a quick glance at Shinzo, who had to see the smallest of smiles pulling at the other boy's lips. There was a bounce in his step as Izuku walked towards the station. He knew Shinzo said he didn't want friends, and he'd probably push Izuku away once he found out about his quirk, but for now, it was his mission to befriend the purple-haired classmate. Unfortunately, Shinzo had disappeared after class, and Izuku hadn't seen him since. But they sat together, so he'd get another chance to talk tomorrow. For now, he pulled out his phone as he walked, checking the admin chat. Sleepy Cat. Guys? Guys, there's a boy in my class and I have no idea how to talk to him. Izuku smiled. His admins all had some kind of degree of social awkwardness. Chris. Ha! Same! I want to be friends with this boy in my class, but he doesn't act like he wants friends. Ryoku. Guys, did you both get a crush on your first day? Sleepy Cat. Oh god, no! He just sits next to me, and I want to be friends, but I don't know how to talk to people. I'm worried I'm going to scare him off or something. Chris. I just want to be friends because he was pushing everyone else away. It's not a crush. Ryoku. I was kidding, but I'm not even a beginner on friendship, so I'm no use to you guys here. Sorry. Brett. My advice would just be to be yourself. It worked pretty well when I started school. Sleepy Cat. Right, because being a grumpy insomniac is totally gonna get me friends. Ryoku. You never know. Besides, you're a grumpy insomniac here and we're your friends. Sleepy Cat. Sure. Thanks, guys. I have to go. I'm supposed to be training. Hi guys! Thank you so much for tuning back in, and so many thanks for everyone who commented and liked and subscribed. Sorry, it's amazing, and I never thought I would get this much attention just by reading a fanfiction that I enjoy. Again, I want to thank Ended Flames from AO3, and I sent the link to the last video to their what is it called? Account, yes, on AO3. So give them some love as well. I will link their fanfiction in the description downstairs. As you see, I went down from 10 chapters per reading to 5 chapters, especially after Present Mike's voice. I just can't. It's already hurting again. I'm not used to talking this much. Anyway, thank you so much, and if you enjoyed, consider liking, maybe even subscribe. Or if you have any feedback, comment down just comment if you have anything to say. I'm really happy that you enjoyed it last time, and I will try to get a schedule together to make it more like comment to post. Anyway, I hope to get it out in the next part out in the next 2 weeks, maybe. I will give my best. We'll go plus ultra. See you again next time. Have fun and live life.
And please, drink. I know you're most likely as bad as I am. We need to hydrate.